Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone to check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. Thank you, Al. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Welcoming our special guest is the gentleman at Heritage who needs no introduction, our founder and the former president of the Heritage Foundation, Dr. Edwin J. Fulner. Dr. Fulner.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you one and all for being here. Ken Edelman's a very, very special friend. We're both Southside Chicagoans by birth. We're both White Sox fans, which puts us on the opposite side of George Will and most of the Washington establishment. And he taught me so much, Ken did. Ken, when I had the great honor of serving with him, with Gene Kirkpatrick as the public delegate with the rank of ambassador at the United Nations, he taught me how to go to a National Day party at the Waldorf and then at the Pierre and how to sneak out through the kitchen immediately after you shook hands with the host ambassadors. I think you used to do that about 4 nights a week. Ken and I have something else in common. We're both Agatha Christie fans. My favorite Agatha Christie movie is Murder on the Orient Express. I've seen it a couple dozen times, and you always get something new out of it. And the neat thing about seeing the movie is kind of the neat thing about reading this book. We all know what happened at Reykjavik, but I started reading this, as you suggested, like an Agatha Christie novel, and the reason this book is important, in my opinion, is 25 years later, all the stuff is declassified. You can read what the Soviets were saying to each other in their notes because all that stuff is public. You can read what Don Reagan and George Shultz are saying to each other and how poor Ken had to get on an airplane and go down and tell Bob Hawke, the socialist in Australia, but a good anti-communist, what had really happened in Reykjavik. And it really fills in a lot of the blanks. And Ken, we are so excited to have you here to tell us about this. And it's going to be a great, I didn't know it was going to be a show and tell, but it's fantastic. You pulled together a video. Welcome back to the Heritage Foundation, my dear friend. And we really hope a lot of people take the time to read it, to find out the detail, the incredible negotiating stand that our president took against all the odds, against some of his own advisors here in town, and why we won the Cold War. Ken, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ed. Ed did just such a great job as outside advisor to Ronald Reagan and head of this organization for so long, and it was just an honor to know him there. And he was a force. He was a great, great force for good in the 1980s. So it is wonderful to be here. What Ed didn't tell you is I've written 5 previous books. As someone said, the most precious copy of the previous books are an unsigned copy, actually. There are virtually no unsigned copy. And when you have an unsigned copy with a receipt from a store that someone actually bought it, that's in the rare book department of that. So I think that Reagan at Reykjavik will be different. It'll be different for basically 3 reasons. Number one is it's a great story. It's an Agatha Christie-like story in this isolated house, creaky old house that was thought to be haunted on one weekend with rain lashing at the windowsills, and 2 remarkable individuals experienced the strangest things in the world. Secondly, those 2 remarkable individuals are unbelievable characters, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And what we get to see, as Ed said, is you get to see them raw. You get to peek through the keyhole of the conference room in Reykjavik and see their back and forth. My chapters 4, 5, and 6 in the book are basically, without me in the picture, back and forth with Reagan and Gorbachev based on the American notes and the Russian notes. And number 3 is the consequence. As Ed told you, I make the point that Reykjavik led to the end of the Cold War, and I'll get into that. But what I wanted to show you now is a little bit about what happened there, and then during the questions, tell you, whatever you wanted to know, basically, but get into more of the negotiations. Basically, this was the second summit that Reagan and Gorbachev had. They had met the year before in Geneva. This was a perfect counterpart to the Reykjavik coming up later. Why is that? Because the Geneva summit was State Department run. It was very constrained. It was very laid out. And it was kind of like a perfect diplomatic summit, that it was tight by the rules and planned down to the nth degree, at which not much happened. Just what the diplomats would want, and just ideal in that. To me, the most wonderful part of the summit happened right at the beginning, when we were standing in the hallway, and we had spent 6 months preparing for the summit. At Reykjavik, we had spent 12 days preparing and non-preparing, to tell you the truth. But for 6 months, we decided to have the summit in a neutral country, Switzerland, in a neutral city, Geneva, in a neutral place, the Aga Khan's great mansion there, and everything was neutral, okay? But the fact is, we were standing with Reagan in the hallway. The Secret Service came up and said that Mikhail Gorbachev's big ZIL limo was coming, and without hesitating, Ronald Reagan, this is being November in Central Europe, cold. Ronald Reagan rushes out to greet him. You see Mikhail Gorbachev head to foot swaddled in wool. And what's more remarkable is that as they're coming up the stairs, Ronald Reagan kind of gestures like welcoming a guest into his abode, his European White House, basically. And after all these negotiations of how everything was going to be neutral, and then as they're coming up, the most unbelievable thing happens. Ronald Reagan, who's one generation older than Gorbachev, kind of puts his arm under Gorbachev's elbow to help him up the stairs in case he needs that help. This you can see there on that, and I'm going to let Don Regan tell you what happened.
Secretary Gorbachev to arrive. President Reagan was waiting inside the mansion. He had no coat on. He was asked, did he want to put a coat on? And while he was trying to make up his mind, the Secret Service announced that Gorbachev was there. So Reagan said, my heavens. He raced out the door without his overcoat, down the steps, and just as Gorbachev's limousine door opened, there was Reagan with his hand out, ready to greet him. Gorbachev was bundled up in a muffler, hat, overcoat. Reagan then put his hand under Gorbachev's arm and assisted him up the stairs.
I felt that we lost the game during this first movement. You can compare it with a chess game. We started with the wrong move.
But that was the Soviet spokesman saying that we started with the wrong move. It was just a great occasion. Reykjavik was announced as a surprise. It was Gorbachev wrote a letter to Reagan suggesting either London or Reykjavik in answer to this gentleman's question, and Reagan wanted to choose Reykjavik because both London and Reykjavik were halfway between the two capitals. He chose Reykjavik because the Queen wasn't there, Thatcher wasn't there, the Europeans weren't there, nothing was there. Nothing was in Reykjavik, a little country of 240,000 people, a capital of 120,000 people. And therefore, it was going to be a low-key summit at which nothing much was ever going to happen. All right? And Reagan, in his announcement on the South Lawn of the White House the day he leaves for Reykjavik, which was on the 9th of October, says this isn't even going to be a summit. This is a meeting to kind of prepare for a summit. Well, basically, government being what it is, and the Cold War being what it was, and the two leaders being what they were, it quickly ballooned. Here you see a preparatory meeting about a week before the summit, We have 55 members of the preparatory meeting. The Americans on the left side, the Soviets on the right side, and the Icelanders right there getting ready for making preparations. This is a cartoon at the time. Well, Mick, I see you're all set for a low-key, one-on-one, non-summit. Gorbachev, in his plane, brings 300 people with him. We had about 25 or 30 in our party, but he has 300 people with him. Okay, this is the Prime Minister of Iceland, believe it or not. The Icelanders, needless to say, were not prepared for any invasion like happened. Even though this is low-key, nothing much is going to happen. 3,217 journalists are accredited by the time the summit opens. The Prime Minister has no idea what's going to hit him and what did hit him. And people said, well, we'd like an interview with you. He said, fine. And they said, well, what time are you available? The Prime Minister says, whenever you're available, I'm available. And Tom Brokaw here chose a time where he goes into his daily dip in the thermal springs there. And so he said, just come over and do it there. Why his PR person didn't say, let's get a towel a little bit or a bathrobe or something, I have no idea. But it's one of the strange pictures of a very strange weekend in Reykjavik. This I wanted actually for the cover of the book. I thought it would sell more. This is Miss World, who was Iceland's own Miss World. She had been in a goodwill tour of Asia at the time and was called back from Singapore for this. And she had press availability every day of the summit on that. I thought it would be great to put her on the cover and rename the book something like Sex, Cats, Dieting, and Reagan at Reykjavik. I thought it would really help sales enormously, but my publisher thought that was a little off topic here on this. This is Raisa Gorbachev. She surprised us all by appearing at Reykjavik. Nancy Reagan was pretty sure, because the staff told her, that Raisa wasn't going to be there. Raisa shows up, and because there was a press blackout during the summit itself, she has the stage to herself. And boy, did she use the stage well. She changed her outfits 4 times on the first day of the summit, which is a little robust. That's, I think, 3 more times than I've ever changed my outfit on a day. And she went around seeing the sights of Reykjavik, of which there are very few, and not many worth seeing, to tell you the truth. And so she goes running around, and it is in 7th heaven. This is one of my favorite photos. It took me about 2 years to get all the photos of Reykjavik. This is one of my favorite photos. And what I love about it is it's the president of Iceland, the first elected female president in the world, and they are taking a walk around the presidential, house, the chateau in Iceland, or little house, basically. Ronald Reagan is wearing some coat that he must have gotten from a movie set on somewhere, an Ulster fur-lined coat. The odd thing is, well, everything about Reykjavik was odd. The odd thing is I never saw him wear this coat again, either that weekend or any other time. And he is just looking like $1 million. Plus, the conversation was awfully wonderful. She says to him, there's no school on how to be a president. And she says, because there's no school on how to be a president, I think theater is the best place to learn that. She had been director of the Iceland Theater before that and an actress herself. And she said, I think theater is the best place to learn that because with theater, you're thinking about society and personalities and relationships all the time. Reagan lit up when he heard that, and he called her my old colleague ever after that time. This is the Hofty House. I say in the introduction, which Ed mentioned, in the introduction, there are 4 great characters this weekend. Mikhail Gorbachev, Ronald Reagan, Akramayov, Field Marshal Akramayov, that I'll get to in a minute, and the Hofty House. The Hofty House is a great character. It is thought to be haunted. In fact, when you saw that Tom Brokaw interview with the Prime Minister, he was asked about whether the Hofty House was haunted. He said 2 things. First of all, his whole family thinks that ghosts exist and leprechauns. 55% of Icelanders thought elves and leprechauns and ghosts and gods and everything in Iceland existed at the time. And he says, if there are ghosts in the Hofti house, they are more than welcome there. He would be happy to have them. You can see it's a very little house right there. And since that time, it's been a real tourist attraction because of the summit right there. We had basically, the house was divided, and there was a parlor on one side that the Americans had. There's a parlor on the other that the Russians had. They had a DMZ, like in Korea, Ed, that was between the two. And the basement was phenomenal. The basement was divided in half between the KGB on one side and the CIA on the other, both of which are having all their equipment there. Presumably, I hope somebody from the CIA was taking pictures of the KGB equipment, because you get millions of dollars for pictures like that. And they had one dispute that was that there was a big bathroom in the basement and a little bathroom. And there was negotiations before the summit began because both sides wanted the larger loo. And the caretaker said, I don't know how to solve this. The Russian KGB guy said, oh, to hell with it. Let's just use whatever. And so while the intelligence services around the world operate on a need-to-know basis, on that weekend it was a need-to-go basis, all right? And I told Ed that this is the only book ever written, I bet, that has in the index an entry called urinal diplomacy. And it has that on that. But I defy anybody to show me another urinal diplomacy. This is one of the cartoons. You know that this house is haunted. You think that's spooky, you look next door, and that was, of course, the height of the Cold War. They met first time on Saturday morning, October 11th. Gorbachev came. Reagan again kind of welcomed him there. This is where the negotiations took place. You'll notice it's a very small room. You have the two, Gorbachev there, you have Reagan right there, you have Foreign Minister Shevardnadze right there, George Shultz right there. You have a translator, the American translator there for Reagan. You have the Gorbachev's translator right there. And you can not see, but the note taker, Gorbachev's note taker, the Russian note taker is there, the American note taker is out of the picture. And so it was basically them right there. It's remarkable in 10 and a half hours of conversation. I don't know about you, but I've never had a conversation with anybody for 10 and a half hours over one weekend. If I did with my wife, she would walk out on me or anything. But it's a long time to discuss the main issues of the day. And during that time, the Foreign Minister, Shevardnadze, and Secretary of State Shultz participate very little, to tell you the truth. It's really the two of them. They participate without notes, without talking points, without memos. So basically what you are seeing is you are seeing these two men raw, and they must have felt more like themselves than any time in office. They were unprogrammed, they were unplanned, and they were at this come-as-you-are summit that basically to be themselves, and they really were. It's remarkable on that. This is a BBC version that was done right after Reykjavik about the bubble, which is a room within the room for very secure conversations, okay? And the bubble was filled. The president surprised us by coming, and I gave up my seat, but I wasn't willing to give up my place in the bubble.
Mikhail Gorbachev surprised the world when he proposed a preparatory summit meeting at Reykjavik with Ronald Reagan. Their talks launched the superpowers on a new path towards the first agreements ever to cut their stockpiles of nuclear weapons. What follows is a dramatization of the inside story of Reykjavik.
All right, let's get into the bubble.
Mr. President, when are you going to raise human rights?
Well, he spent the whole morning here on arms control. I should respond on that.
Mr. President, if you start with human rights, for sure you're going to end up with arms control. But if you start on arms control, you're going to stay on arms control, so human rights will get squeezed out.
Thanks, Ken. George, we can't have just one working party. We want a second group on the other things, human rights, Afghanistan, bilateral issues.
Okay, I was told that actor, that was the height of his career, which is pretty pathetic if you ask me. But that was a movie done, a kind of dramatization done right after. There is a movie in the works that is going to be far more substantive. This is Christoph Waltz is going to play Gorbachev, and Michael Douglas is going to play Reagan. 2 weeks ago, I was at a diner in outside of Charlottesville and Monticello for a program at Monticello, and my cell phone rings. It was Michael Douglas. He had read 2/3 of the book. He was on chapter 7, and he loves the book, and he is so anxious to play Reagan. He said he's the only person in the world that can go from Liberace to Reagan, and I believe that. And so the filming is going to be this fall, and then the release will be next year. Ridley Scott is the overall producer. I am executive producer, and I told them when they asked me, I said, now listen, if executive producer means somebody who knows how to make a movie, I have no idea how to make a movie. I hardly know how to watch a movie, And I said, but, however, if executive producer is just a title and not a function, I'm your man. So they said, no, it's just a title. It's not a function. They were very relieved to know that I wanted to do nothing and would do nothing. That was a big draw to make me executive producer on that. This is one of the downtimes, the only downtimes at Reykjavik. This is in the ambassador's house. There's kind of a sad story. You must have known Rue at the time. He's a good guy. He was a very good guy. He was treated very shabbily that weekend. What happened was the summit came as a surprise. By the time he heard about it, the KGB and the Secret Service had known about it for 2 days. They had busily gobbled up all the hotel rooms in the city, of which there were not that many, and other places to stay. So then the State Department informed Nick Rui that the good news is the president is going to stay at your house, which he was delighted by. The bad news is you're not. By the time he heard that, there was no room in the city. And so he basically disappears at that time. And it's kind of sad because the only thing happening between Iceland and the United States in the whole history of the world happened that weekend, and our American ambassador is nowhere to be seen. So this is at the American ambassador's residence without the resident American ambassador, however. And this is, here's Poindexter and Schultz preparing a paper to discuss. Don Regan, chief of staff. Max Campbellman, a wonderful guy who died about a year ago. And there's yours truly with dark hair at that time. I dye my hair right now jet white to look older, but it really has black roots. I told you that Raisa was running around town. Here she is at one of the thermal springs, the pool's right there. She was just looking for places to go to and things to do. But she had a great press entourage because that was the only game in town then that was not part of the news blockout on that. And so she was in her second outfit of 4 for that day for this stop. This is during the time, the big question was both presidents wanted to reduce nuclear weapons, and they both proceeded to, but they got hung up on the Strategic Defense Initiative. Reagan thought it was going to change everything, which he ended up being absolutely right. It did change everything. And Gorbachev thought it was the end of the Soviet Union if SDI was built. I love this, just Jeff McNally, a friend of ours. Gorbachev says, and anyway, we don't think such a crazy thing would ever work. You got a light. And Reagan says, sure, contacts an SDI unit, and boom, the cigarette lights up, and he says this Star Wars stuff drives him nuts. And I do love to see Reagan's face right there, which Jeff McNally, I think the only conservative cartoonist I've ever seen in history. But he was just a wonderful, wonderful guy and a good friend of ours on that. This is Saturday night in Reykjavik. There was part protest, part street festival. Joan Baez flew in for a live performance. Perfect, isn't it? And so she was there. Meanwhile, what happened was we went on that same night at 8 o'clock. We, the arms control team, met in the Hofty House. We started our negotiations at 9 o'clock at night. We ended our negotiations at 8 o'clock at night. We ended our negotiations at 6:20 the next morning. We took a break at 3:15 at that time. Leading the Soviet delegation was a man called Field Marshal, 5-star general, Sergei Akrameyev. We had all heard of Akrameyev beforehand. None of us had met him. He appeared suddenly and surprisingly, and he was an amazing character. Somebody told me that reading the Akrameyev story throughout this book is part of the charm of the book because it was such an unexpected. He got there, and what we knew, because we had done it for years, is the Soviets, Karpov and all these guys, Arbatov and all them, they would harangue and harangue and harangue about issues, okay? And this started, our negotiations started at 8 o'clock. One of these guys started haranguing about 3 minutes after 8. And Akrameyev was in the main chair, and what happened was unbelievable. When the Arbatov or Karpov next to him started haranguing, he turned to him, he put his hand on their arm, just like this. He just looked at him. They kind of sputtered down. Then he turned to us and he said, where were we? Just like, forget about all that flack in the air. This happened about 3 or 4 times that night. Each time he gave his 5-star stare at the person. They sputtered down and he turned back and he says, okay, let's continue. He just didn't want any of that. And he was an amazing, amazing man. He was the next year at Geneva. We were at the final throes of getting the arms control agreement in, and we met in November of 1987 in Geneva. And the fact is that we had arms control coming out our ears all day long. We had a meeting at a meal at Shevardnadze's place, the foreign minister's place, and some people started to talk about arms control, and thank God I said at that meal, General Akrameyev, Marshal Akrameyev, why don't you tell us your story from World War II? Because he was the only Soviet soldier still serving who had been active in World War II. He lit up like it was just the happiest day of his life. He told us the story that for 18 months, he was stationed on the road to Leningrad. He did not go inside a building for 18 months. In the Russian winter outside of Leningrad, it got 20 below zero. The Northern Panzer Division of the Germans were attacking all the time. He had a little pup tent, and he and his guys stayed on that road to block that road from the Germans taking over. And he told a story. He had lost the hearing in his right ear. He had shrapnel throughout his body, but he had made it unlike most of his buddies. And he told us, and Colin Powell was at that road trip with us, and then they talked about what kind of tank and things like that. And after about 40 minutes of absolutely mesmerizing us, we had to go because the evening was going to get late, and we had a whole day of negotiating again. George Shultz said very nicely to him, General Akrameyev, that was just so inspirational. That kind of devotion, that kind of dedication is what made the Americans so admire about the Russian people and the Soviet people, and he went on like that. Akrameyev says, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. That's so wonderful of you to say. But let me just tell you that had we moved from that road, Stalin would have had us shot. Kind of ruined the atmosphere a little bit, but I thought, isn't that wonderful? It's just a great comment. I visited him, and I'll show you the picture of Akrameyev. He's right here, interestingly enough, looking warily at Reagan, Reagan looking warily at him right there. I visited Akrameyev 6 months after I got out of government, and he was at the White House signing for the INF Treaty, very proud of that. And 6 months later, I was in the Kremlin, and he invited me. I was there for some kind of conference after government. He invited me over to his office. Very nicely, we talked. He showed me his office. He showed me his chandelier. He showed me his, everything, and we talked about the events of the world at that time. And in 1991, in September 26 of 1991, I opened up the Washington Post, and there, buried in paragraph 6 of the article by Michael Mobbs, is the fact that Akrameyev committed suicide. He had hung himself in his office by the chandelier he had shown us. And he wrote various two known and one unknown suicide notes, saying that everything that he had ever stood for is now gone. I saw this in the Washington Post. I was out of my mind, thinking back of the times. Colin Powell, by that time, was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I called, it was 7 o'clock in the morning, and called his office. They said he was in a briefing already. I said, well, that's fine. Just tell him Ken Edelman called whenever he can call back. And she said, hold on a minute. And the phone picked up. He says, Kenny, I thought the same thing. Isn't it unbelievable about Akrameyev? I didn't say what I called about. I didn't say anything, but we were both very affected. Just when we thought it couldn't get worse, they had the funeral for Akrameyev. No military came. No foreign officials came. No bugles. No honors. This is the most decorated man in Soviet history. A man who won the greatest award available, the Hero of the Soviet Union. 5-star. Our last 5-star was, I think, Omar Bradley, yeah. And so he was buried absolutely as a nobody in a common cemetery with just his wife and his 2 daughters and a few friends there. A week after he's buried, vandals dig up the grave and steal his uniform and throw the body elsewhere. So it is the saddest story of somebody I found quite remarkable, to tell you the truth. This is on Sunday afternoon, late on Sunday afternoon, when we're in sudden death overtime for the summit. You can see a very exhausted Paul Nitze, then almost 70 years old, who had done an all-nighter. I had done an all-nighter and was dragging at the age of 40. Don Reagan, President, is sitting in the corner reading our last proposal. Schultz, Poindexter, and yours truly right there, standing up right there. The fact is that Reagan was saying, this is my last offer. I really want to get home. I told Nancy I would be home for dinner. And I said, well, Mr. President, Mrs. Reagan's going to know where you are, and it's not like you're up to no good or something like that. There are 3,217 journalists there. And he said, I know, but I told Nancy I'd be home to dinner. And, he was going to miss the dinner anyway on that. So that was our final offer. What happened then was remarkable. Reagan leaves. All of us say, good luck, Mr. President. We know this is a very big moment in history. He walks out the door, and then within, I'd say 20 seconds, he comes back in. So he didn't even have time to go down. We were on the second floor. He didn't have time to go down to the first floor of the little conference room. So we said, what? He says, I just want to make sure that we're doing right by America. I just want to make sure that we're not getting carried away. And then he had us in a circle like that, and he asked each of us, are you sure we're doing okay? I thought to myself, isn't that wonderful? That not getting carried away by summit fever, not getting carried away by negotiating fever, just taking a calm, just making sure that what we were doing, his word, was right by America. And in my 27 years since Reykjavik, when I think of Ronald Reagan's leadership, I think of that moment. What an amazing thing it was to have him do that. This is broke up. The summit broke up because Reagan was not willing to compromise on SDI, and he was madder than hell, I'll tell you that. This, Jim Kuhn, who's his special aide right in back of him, kind of there, gave an oral history at which he said he never saw Reagan more emotionally disturbed except when Nancy went in for her cancer surgery. And we went back to the ambassador's house, and Reagan couldn't even sit down. He was just walking around. No one could talk to him. He was furious. He then went out the 30 miles to Cheerfully, which was the air base and the airport right there, and he was scheduled to talk to the troops for 2 minutes and then to take off. And he was madder than hell till he got in front of the troops, and then he just lit up because, and this is Time Magazine's no deal because of SDI, and Reagan lit up telling the troops he couldn't be mad in front of all those fresh-faced patriots who were serving in uniform. He told a wonderful story at Cheerfully that when he was named president, he knew, because of World War II service, that you're not allowed to salute unless you're in uniform. And he asked the commandant the first week he was in office, he said, I know that rule, but the fact is, I'm commander-in-chief. Can't I salute? I'm not in uniform, but there is no uniform for a commander-in-chief. And I really want to. And the commander-in-chief, according to Reagan, said some wise words to him. He said, well, Mr. President, if you did it, I don't think any of us would mind. And so after that time, it was virtually impossible for Reagan to go anywhere without saluting anything that moved on there. This was a funny thing. There's a letter I found 10 days ago. I did research. I got all kinds of documents from Reykjavik. I got documents from the Reagan Library. I got documents from Washington. In storage in our house was this letter written to me from the president about Reykjavik that I didn't know existed until a week ago. For some reason, I just put it in a file and found it. So this book that has every document known to Reykjavik, about Reykjavik, and 375 footnotes in the book, doesn't have any mention of the letter he wrote to me about Reykjavik. Very nice. The next year, of course, comes this speech.
If you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
And this is the line no one wanted him to, nobody wanted him to say. Everybody opposed it, including in the car on the way to the speech.
Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It's still great, isn't it? And what was so fantastic, and I have a whole bit in here you saw, Ed, about how everybody opposed the speech. And they mostly opposed, not just the tear down this wall that was thought to upset superpower relations, but they mostly opposed him making it personal. I mean, that was the thing that sent them off the wall. And the fact is, when he said, Mr. Gorbachev, and when you notice in that delivery, he says it twice, like up yours. Those are, in case anybody missed the first time on the real offensive part, I'll say it again. Mr. Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's a great moment. The first ladies were warm and loving towards each other, as you can see from this big photo. They were, by the time of the Washington summit, they were mostly tolerating each other and not doing a real good job of it at that, for various reasons. This is the signing ceremony of the most sweeping arms control agreement based on what happened in Reykjavik the next year. And you can see they're sitting right there. At the first row was Schultz, Shevardnadze. There is Akrameov right there, And then the KGB and the CIA and the Secret Service mostly was in the second row. They all, were sitting together on that. And then the third row were the arms control team. There's Paul Nitze, there's Colin Powell, there's myself, and the Joint Chiefs are right there. I'm still mortified by all of us being put in front of the Joint Chiefs. But anyway, so be it, and it was a great day at the White House on that. This is, Reagan really loved it. And then the next summer, he was in Moscow for the Moscow summit. This picture is just a great picture. Under a hammer and sickle and the 6-foot large bust of Lenin. And what Reagan did there was like an Old Testament preacher. He was preaching free enterprise and freedom in the Soviet Union. Before that time, you didn't go and you didn't criticize a country while you were the guest of that country. I mean, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon went to China at the time of the Cultural Revolution, okay? When Mao's madness, contributed among the 35 million people that Mao destroyed. They never ever mentioned the Cultural Revolution at that time. And here's Reagan going to place to place to place, preaching the virtue of free enterprise and freedom on that. This is the last night that they were there. Someone asked the president, after 4 days of exhausted meetings here, running around the town, and then going to the state dinner and then the Bolshoi ballet afterwards, why in the middle of the night did you want to walk around Red Square? And he said simply, we're leaving tomorrow. Nancy hasn't seen it yet, and I didn't want her to go and not see this site. So he took her there, and it's a lovely, lovely photo on that. This is in 1989. This is Honecker, the kind of Stalinist leader of East Germany. And this is on the 40th anniversary, one of the most unhappy anniversaries ever, thank God, for the East German Republic. This is Gorbachev saying hello to Honecker in what I think is a kiss a little bit more passionate than it needs to be between comradely, according to the manual of comradely kisses. I think they went a little overboard on this. But it was nice because it was a kiss-off as well as an embrace, because Gorbachev told him, you're on your own. And before, 6 weeks, he was gone. And thank God. The wall fell on November 9th, 1989. Rostropovich was in Europe at the time, absolutely had an emotional overcoming. He grabbed a plane. He took his cello, he came to the wall unannounced, unexpected, and he said, all I need is a chair. And someone produced him a chair, and he sat there playing Bach for unaccompanied cello for an hour and a half to express his motion. 2 months later, and the Brandenburg Gate opened, Leonard Bernstein came, conducted an orchestra with the Ode of Joy, for Beethoven's Ode to Joy, and it was members of the East German, West Germany, United States, France, Britain, Russia, all in an orchestra together. He finished it, the place erupted, and bells were rung all on both sides of Berlin on that occasion. This is the next year, the ending of the Cold War. Look at this. Just a great, great ending of exactly the strategy that Reagan wanted. That was in 1991. 3 years later, Ronald Reagan wrote a handwritten letter to the American people that is really one of the great, great things. And I had somebody look at this and read parts of it.
November 5th, 1994. My fellow Americans, I have recently been told that I am one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease. Unfortunately, as Alzheimer's disease progresses, the family often bears a heavy burden. I only wish there was some way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience. When the time comes, I am confident that with your help, she will face it with faith and courage. In closing, let me thank you, the American people, for giving me the great honor of allowing me to serve as your president. When the Lord calls me home, whenever that may be, I will leave the greatest love for this country of ours and eternal optimism for its future. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. Thank you, my friends. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan.
I love that letter, and I love the way that he crossed out things. This is not a staff-driven enterprise at all. I love the way he misspells some of the words in the letter. And when I did the book, someone suggested, oh, well, it's kind of hard to read, and why don't I just type it out and put it as regular print? And I thought about it because it would be a lot easier, and then I decided I don't want to do that. There's an immediacy to seeing the crossed out words. There's immediacy to seeing the words. So I have a little, and you'll see it in there, Ed, I have a little footnote. I have endnotes for most of the 375, but I have one footnote in the book, and it says basically there is a typed up version at the last part, but I said, admittedly, it is in many respects hard to read, but imagine it's a lot harder to have written than it is to read. So I had that. 2 years later, I was back for the 10th anniversary of Reykjavik. I went to the Hofty House. I had, I don't want to say a religious experience, but I got carried away by the emotion of what had happened and what Reagan had done there. And I went around to our sites in the bubble that was then used as a kind of storage bin at that time, in where we did our all-night negotiations, in the parlor, and I felt a absolute enormous amount of emotion in returning to those sites. I then walked into town from Hofty House and stopped at a drugstore, and I got a postcard like this. And I wrote, Mr. President, I didn't know his address or anything. I knew he was in Alzheimer's at that time. I said, Mr. President, I am, and I addressed it to Presidential Library, Simi Valley, California. I said, I'm back on the 10th anniversary of this weekend, and I'm thinking back at the wonderful job that you did during that weekend and how very proud I was to have served you. And 2 weeks later, I was out at the Reagan Library, and Mrs. Nixon was there, and I told her that I had sent her husband a postcard, and she looked at Mrs. Reagan, and I told her I had sent a postcard, and she said, she looked at me like, didn't you hear? Didn't you get the memo that my husband can't read anything? And she said, I said, I understand the condition and all that, but I just wanted to write him. And she said, well, what'd you say? And I told her, I said, Mr. President, I'm thinking back at the wonderful job you did 10 years ago and how very proud I was to serve you. And then she broke down crying and I broke down crying. And it was just a very wonderful, wonderful moment. I just got about 3 days ago, I got a very nice letter from her because I sent her an advance copy of the book. And on that. Then, of course, in June of 2004, it's the 10th anniversary coming up, is the Reagan funeral, and there was such an outpouring of emotion for this person. And I love this picture when the motorcade was going by with the casket. Here are two firefighters on that. This is another favorite picture of mine of many. The funeral procession was going underneath the viaduct, and they were standing at attention, people putting their hands over their hearts on that. And the final kissing of the coffin before it was lowered down on that. The main emotion I felt was not at, we were at the funeral, and we were very honored to be at National Cathedral, the funeral, but the day before, something remarkable happened, and I'll never forget it. Unbeknownst and unannounced, and unbeknownst to all of us, Mikhail Gorbachev flew in to what would later become Ronald Reagan National Airport and went to the Capitol building where the coffin was lying in state, was allowed inside the little roped-off part, stood there for a minute outside, then walked forward, put his hand on the casket, gave it a rub, and gave it a pat, and said goodbye to President Reagan, as we all did. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Reagan at Reykjavik. Thank you. Let's take a few questions, and then I have a 2-minute treat for you after the questions. Yeah, please.
Henry now.
Yeah. Hello, Henry.
How are you?
Good. Flip it over.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you. One of those 5 books you wrote earlier was a book on, well, it has a long chapter on Reykjavik in 1989.
Uh-huh.
My first question is, what differences
Yeah.
between that book and this book based on what's been revealed since? And secondly, Ronald Reagan believed in deterrence, but he didn't believe in mutual assured destruction.
Yeah.
He believed in something that I think could be called mutual assured protection,
Yeah.
sharing defensive systems, lowering offensive systems. Is that an idea that he, how do you think about that idea, or how did he think about that idea, and is it worth further study?
And it's not only worth further study, it's worth doing, to tell you the truth. What this book differs in the first chapter, the chapter I had on Reykjavik, in a very fundamental way. That chapter I wrote as part of a whole expose about arms control in general. I did not have the notes. I didn't have the American notes. I didn't have the Russian notes on that. And so I couldn't look in that little room. I was there. I talked to the president before and after, in the sessions in the bubble and elsewhere. But, it's kind of sketchy, and and he was kind of sketchy about what had happened. But with the advent of the American notes and the Russian notes, you really see them. You really understand exactly what they said to each other. And it's amazing. It's amazing. I told Ed before, I said, one of the goals of this book, I don't know if I'll achieve it, but among fair-minded people I will. One of the goals of this book is to have anybody who reads the book cannot come away with the idea, oh my gosh, Ronald Reagan didn't know the issues very well. Ronald Reagan wasn't all that bright. Ronald Reagan was out to lunch. He was gaga and everything like that. You just can't do that. I mean, you see when he's discussing with Gorbachev, Gorbachev doesn't know any more about the issues than Reagan does. Gorbachev doesn't come across any smarter. Gorbachev doesn't come across any quicker. What is remarkable is that in their 10.5 hours, that Gorbachev says about 11 or 12 times, and I've counted them, I'm making all the concessions here. You haven't given me anything. And you know what Ronald Reagan says when each time that Gorbachev says that to him? He says nothing. He says nothing. He sits there, and I'm sure he thinks, what's wrong with that? Sounds fine to me, And and we have the notes of Gorbachev on the plane going from Reykjavik to Moscow. And he tells his guys, I gave the president I made all the concessions. And Reagan gave me nothing. Gorbachev says it in a flowery way. He picked the fruits from my basket, and I picked nothing from his basket. Well, it was absolutely honest, and by and large, Gorbachev was an honest guy. It was kind of silly to say to his staff, but he did have that. Yeah.
Ken, Reagan and the staff, Wayne Vallis, Reagan and the staff mess after this talked about that Gorbachev found out that Reagan was not an actor, he was a union leader. He told us.
That's a good point.
In the White House mess that that's what Gorbachev found out, that I was a union leader. He said, and those Hollywood moguls hated to negotiate me when I was the head of the Screen Actors Guild.
Yeah, and he loved negotiating, and he thought he was very good at it. And there's no way to read Reagan at Reykjavik without knowing that he was very good at it. All right, our last treat for you is that these are part of the 1981 that Ed and I were there, 1981 inaugural address, and someone put nice pictures on this. It's a real treat.
If we look to the end as to why for so many years we achieved so much, prospered as no other people on earth, it was because here in this land we unleashed the energy and individual genius of man to a greater extent than has ever been done before. Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth. The price for this freedom at times has been high, but we have never been unwilling to pay that price. Those who say that we're in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look. The sloping hills of Arlington National Cemetery, with its row upon row of simple white markers bearing crosses or stars of David, they add up to only a tiny fraction of the price that has been paid for our freedom. Each one of those markers is a monument to the kind of hero I spoke of earlier. Their lives ended in places called Belleau Wood, the Argonne, Omaha Beach, Salerno, and halfway around the world on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Pork Chop Hill, the Chosin Reservoir, and in 100 rice paddies and jungles of a place called Vietnam. Under one such marker lies a young man, Martin Treptow, who left his job in a small-town barber shop in 1917 to go to France with the famed Rainbow Division. There on the Western Front, he was killed trying to carry a message between battalions under heavy artillery fire. We're told that on his body was found a diary. On the flyleaf, under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone. We must realize that no arsenal or no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. It is a weapon our adversaries in today's world do not have. It is a weapon that we as Americans do have. Let that be understood by those who practice terrorism and prey upon their neighbors. As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever. We are Americans.
It's a nice way to remember Ronald Reagan. Thank you very much.